Today, I want to talk about a question I get an awful lot, and that's from people who buy loose vintage watch movements and they want to know, how do you find a case that fits? If you've got a loose movement on your bench, maybe from a parts lot or a donor watch, and you want to bring it back to life, you're going to need to know what's important. Today, we'll talk about what actually needs to line up inside the watch, the diameter, the stem height, the thickness, all that. And I'm going to give you a simple checklist of some real world examples so you don't waste time or money chasing the wrong case. If you want more details, I wrote a blog post on my website. I'll leave a link in the show notes. All right, first up, how do you know if the movement and dial actually fit a case? Every watch case has an internal diameter where the dial needs to sit. There's usually a little lip or ledge inside the case that's called the reha or the dial seat. Your dial has to be small enough to fit in there, but not so small that it just rattles around inside the movement. If you've got calipers, measure the dial across its center. If it's, say, 30 millimeters, then you want a case that says it accepts a 30 millimeter dial. You could go down maybe to 28 or 29 millimeters, but don't try to shove a 32 millimeter dial in a 30 millimeter opening. It just won't fit. And if it's too small, you're going to get ugly gaps around the outside edge. Oh, and if you're swapping dials, watch the dial feet. Dial feet need to match the movement. If they don't, you'll either be trying to modify the dial feet or trying to attach it with dial dots, which is something that I don't recommend for the long term. All right, here's where people run into the most trouble, and that's the stem height. Now, the stem, of course, is that little rod coming out of the crown that goes in the movement, and it needs to hit the center of the case tube. Not be too high, not too low. It needs to be dead center. Otherwise, the crown won't sit right on the tube, and the winding will feel like you're just fighting the watch. Now, every movement has a stem height. That's the distance from the front of the dial up to the middle of the stem. Now, if the case tube is lower or higher than that, it's going to put a lot of stress on the parts and more likely it'll just break. So how do you measure to get the stem height? With calipers, you're going to measure from the front of the dial to the top of the stem. Then you want to measure the thickness of the stem and divide that number in half. You subtract that number, which is half the thickness of the stem, and subtract it from the first measurement, and that's the thickness of the movement from the front of the dial to the center of the stem. Now, this is the measurement that your case needs to have. Now, if you have a case, you can measure from the dial seat, where the dial sits, to the top of the case tube. And then you measure the case tube and you divide it in half and subtract that half again from your first measurement. Those numbers need to match or they need to be really close. Now, there are instances where I've made small shims before to nudge the movement up just a bit, but if you're off by, say, a half a millimeter or more, usually that means it's time to look for another case. You'd be amazed how often people overlook this. They get the diameter right? Because that's pretty easy, but the stem height comes in, so it's not in the center of the tube, and suddenly the crown either won't stay in, they can't get it engaged in the movement, or it winds so hard that it's not usable. Next, you need to look at the overall movement height and hand clearance. Now, some movements are thick, especially automatics with rotors. Other movements are really thin and slim. You need to know if your case can close once everything's inside. Now, if the movement's too tall, the case back might not be able to be screwed down. And if it's too tight, it might even stop the balance wheel. If it's too shallow, the movement is going to rattle around inside the case, and that's going to cause all kinds of problems. You also have to make sure that the hands clear the crystal. If the hands are too tall, they're going to hit the inside of the crystal and it's going to jam up the watch. So with the minute hand and the sweep second hand installed, measure from the top of the hands to the balance side of the movement so you get the overall thickness. And make sure you have enough movement and make sure you have enough clearance inside the case. Now, in modern movements, there are different cannon pinions with different hand heights. Usually you'll see them called out on part sites like H1, H2, or H3. Vintage watch movements don't always have alternative heights available, but some do. So it's usually best to use a case that was made for the exact movement with the original dimensions. Now, real quickly, let's just talk about how the movement actually stays put inside the case. Now, you got two main parts that will do that. You have movement rings. These are spacers that go around the movement, between the movement and the case. And you have some movements that have case clamps. And these are little tabs that screw into the movement and they fit into a movement groove in the case wall. So you're going to need at least one of these. Without them, the only thing holding your movement in place is the stem. And that's just a recipe for a bent stem or cracked dial feet. Now, there are some vintage cases that hold the movement with a spring ring or just some case back pressure. But these are the exception and not the rule. Okay, so you've got a movement and you've got a case that it should work in, and we come to the big moment. You try to close the case. If you feel any resistance, stop. Something's not right. Check to see, number one, if the hands are touching the crystal. Check that maybe your movement ring is too thick and it needs to be trimmed down a little bit. Maybe the rotor is rubbing on the case back. Whatever it is, don't force it. Otherwise, you'll be breaking parts. Now, once you got it closed, give it a gentle little shake to your ear. And if you hear a rattle, that means the movement's loose. You want to make sure it's tight and quiet when you shake it, except maybe for the rotor swish if it's an automatic. Now, where do you actually get watch cases? Well, the first thing I would search for is NOS cases. NOS stands for New Old Stock. If you can find one made exactly for your movement, that's perfect. So you want to research that movement to see what models manufacturers use that movement in. I would go onto eBay and search for whatever caliber movement you have, that caliber watches, and see what comes up on eBay. And then any watch that has that particular caliber in, you want to write that down so you can go to the next step. And that's looking for a donor watch. Sometimes it's cheaper just to buy a broken watch that used your movement inside the case, because then everything should fit. If you're looking at modern movements like the ETA 2824 or the Seiko NH35, there are tons of third-party cases out there. The only thing you need to do is triple check the stem height and the dial fit. When you're getting a case, it's always best to get the case with the crown, the case tube, the movement ring, and the back. If the crown's missing, now you've got to figure out the thread pitch and the stem length and all these other things. All right, so really the bottom line is you need to measure everything before you buy a case. Start with the movement diameter, the dial size, the stem height, the movement thickness. Make sure the hands are going to clear the crystal and that the case closes without any stress. If you're putting it together and something doesn't feel right, stop and recheck your work. You can make small adjustments with a shim or a ring, but big mismatches, yeah, they're just not worth the headache. Take your time, be precise, and don't be afraid to ask questions in watch forums or communities. And if you have done this and you have any additional tips or questions, please leave a comment. And because there's so much more to learn, I'll see you in the next video.